Welcome to Shortlist Women in Tech series, space for women and girls to find inspiration to pursue their IT career goals. My name is Susanna Chain, and I am talking to Laurie Felker Jones. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. You are a mission-driven tech entrepreneur, if that's okay.
Yes.
You could explain me what you do?
Sure. I think that let me start with a very brief overview of my background because I think it'll be helpful. So I grew up in a household in Texas. I live here in Austin, Texas, so that's where I'm calling in from. And I sort of joked that I wore boots and Birkenstocks growing up because I grew up in the country of Texas, like the rural part of Texas with my father, and then in the liberal city of Austin, Texas, where there's a big tech entrepreneur buzz. And both of my parents worked in public interest. So my dad worked all over the world in international development with agriculture, and my mother worked for the health department. And so I sort of had a mission-driven mindset from an early age and had the opportunity to travel to places like Haiti, Central Mexico, India as a young girl, and it was a very formative experience. What really excites me is systems change. And so I spent the first 15 years or so, part of my career, working in the political world, running political campaigns. And then about 5 years ago, I switched into the world of technology and innovation into startups as a founder myself. And it came from a very personal place. So I had about $3 million under management working on one of the largest political action committees in Texas to elect women. I had about 30 candidates on my roster, and I had 2 children under the age of 2 at home. So that was very challenging. And the only way I was able to figure out how to win at work and at home is I had amazing childcare partners, but finding them was a challenge. And given my work of 20 years working in women's issues and working to elect women, I knew intimately, personally, and then from looking at the data of women in the workforce, that I wasn't the only Gen X millennial person with my problem. So I kept complaining, why is there not kayak.com for daycares and preschools? And so I've never been one to complain without doing something about it. So I was talking to people about my ideas, and I met who was to become my CTO, and he and I joined forces, and I built a startup called Juicebox Hero, and it was the discovery engine and marketplace for finding daycares and preschools. You could get on and find something in your neighborhood. Is it in your price range? Does it have availability? Is it the kind of place that I wanted? Is it Montessori? Is it Christian, etc.? So that people, working people mainly, and mainly women, mainly moms, could find a great partner for their childcare. We had great early initial traction and sort of died in the valley of death. We weren't able to raise the funds we needed to scale, which is not an unusual story for startups in general, but also particularly for women and underrepresented founders in tech. And since then, I have had the great pleasure and privilege to partner with other tech entrepreneurs, mission-driven entrepreneurs in a variety of spaces. I've worked with Techstars entrepreneurs who went through the Techstars Anywhere program with them. She was working on and still is working on a platform for pregnant women and women and children, connecting them with services and products. And then I've worked on an affordable housing startup. I've worked in an industrial technology startup, which is huge systems change, which is amazing, and a robotics healthcare startup. And so I've had a lot of different kinds of sector experience. I am an active advisor. I'm an investment advisor with a platform for female founders specifically, or they have to have at least one woman on the executive team. And that's how I spend my time. I'm also a mom. I have 2 children in elementary school, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. And one of my kids has special needs. So that's something that's kind of unique about our parenting. And I also, a couple last things about me is that I'm really excited and again, humbled and appreciative of the opportunity that I'm currently in an executive master's program at the London School of Economics for entrepreneurship and social business. So how do we mix models to combine purpose and profits? And that is really exciting to me. And then in my very little spare time that I have to myself, I like to spend it in my garden. I don't grow anything you can eat, only things that are beautiful. So I have a fancy, I guess the fancy word is a pollinator garden, but really I just like looking at pretty flowers. So that's what
Honestly, I don't know how you find time for gardening. It's amazing, honestly.
Well, I'm someone, I sort of joke about myself that I'm like a collie. If I don't have a big enough job, I'm going to tear up the blinds. So I'm someone who definitely likes to be in action.
How do you do it? Because I think you must have a very tight schedule for this, but
I do. I am someone that doesn't sit still, and someone that is very structured in my time. I find that as a forcing function for my priorities. So I find that I try to be clear about my priorities and how I want to spend my time. You asked a very precise question, so I want to resurface that question. You said, how do you do it? Which some people say, how do you do it all? And I don't do it all. I very specifically don't do it all. So I don't go to happy hours. I do a lot of walk and talks with my friends. My dog is in the background being a goofball. You can see him here. And I don't cook as much as I'd like to. I have an incredibly supportive partner in my husband. I don't exercise as much as I probably should. So, I mean, there's like things that I don't do. And so what are the things that I do that I want to spend my time on? And it becomes a forcing function for the rest of my life. You know, they say, if you want something done, ask a busy person. So I try and be clear too, when people say, hey, can you help me with this? Or can you do this? No, that's not in my wheelhouse, or I don't have capacity for it. And I hope that clarity on whether I'm interested and available is met with the understanding that I'd love to spend my time on a lot of things that I don't have the time to give all the time. So I have to pick and choose. I, again, am a systems thinker, and I really like thinking about systems change. And while we had a very accessible product for consumers that they were using, the world was not talking about childcare like it has been since COVID-19 hit the world. And so I was talking about childcare as business infrastructure, and that people needed to go to work, and it just wasn't part of the national or international dialogue like it is today. And so I think there's more and more attention being paid to this significant childcare gap in terms of infrastructure for families, but also for business and society. But statistically, women are picking up the slack there, and there's still major challenges, and including that in other significant infrastructure packages we're seeing in the United States right now. President Biden has put forth an infrastructure package, and some legislators have carved that out, like that's not part of roads and bridges. But how do you go build roads and bridges if you don't have anyone to watch your kids?
Yeah, I agree. This question comes from the thought of now with COVID, because we have seen many places shut, and we are working from home, and we are not supposed to mix it with other bubbles. But then how do you do it to work in an environment in which you still have your kids in the background, and they might not be, at least my kids, as good as your dog is being at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think that's the thing, is that the last 18 months have really, I mean, they've been horrible and devastating for a huge part of the world. I mean, a significant devastation economically and personally people have experienced. But at the same time, the veil has been lifted on not only like a lack of a social security net for people who are underemployed or having second shift of labor at home, but we've also come to understand each other as people more, I would like to think. And so we see people's dogs at home, and we're literally brought into people's homes. And there are children at home, and people do have lives, and they do have pets, and they do have loved ones that they're caretaking, whether they be young people or older people. So I think that has been, I have appreciated the dialogue and funding that is going to innovating on caretaking in the United States, at least. I don't know what's happening in other parts of the world, but I know that Pivotal Ventures, which is funded by Melinda French Gates, has significantly invested in caregiving. There's an incredible organization called the Holding Company out of San Francisco that we got to work with. Before they were the Holding Company, there was a pilot out of IDEO.org that was looking at caregiving. And so with my startup, we got to participate in some work with them around caregiving, and they've since spun out and really looking at the spectrum from birth to death on caregiving in the United States, and looking at it from a public sector and private sector, and how do we all work together to build this infrastructure, because it exists, it's just not monetized, and women generally do it.
Why you think there is only 3% of women accessing to IT careers? Because you have access to those women. What do you think how they feel? Why there are not more women in the workforce related to IT? Have you thought about it?
Well, I happen to have this book sitting here. I'm actually actively reading it, but also I knew we were going to be here. So this is an incredible read. Do you know this book, Invisible Women?
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage anybody who is interested in the question that you just posed to pick up this book and read it, because it starts on what are we measuring and how are we biasing women and men against women's brilliance and women's use cases, and what folks call product inclusion. So there's just like, I have a daughter who's 5 years old. And I was reading yesterday this book, and they were talking about how 5-year-old children, when asked to draw scientists, will draw an equal number of female and male scientists in their pictures. And then at 6 years old, it starts to decline. And why is that? It's what they are seeing in school, and the lack of women being included in representation, and just some socialization, a lot of socialization around what is expected from women and expected from men. And so the good news about that is if we're teaching it, we can teach different things. So, and that just piles on in terms of the what we recognize, also in this book, talking about the myth of meritocracy, that we reward a certain archetype, which happens to be default male behavior, and this narrative that gets created around what technologists look like. And I think that you've seen campaigns, right? Well, they'll have a woman and they'll say, this is what a data scientist looks like, or this is what a roboticist looks like. And that starts to open people's eyes, from young people to folks currently in the workforce, about the biases that affect women. And then, I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? You start seeding this information when people are very young, and then that influences what they're learning in school and what they're choosing to learn, and the friction around it, to just say, enough, I'm not dealing with this. And it becomes a vicious cycle, a systemic cycle of, if more and more women are doing unpaid care work in a second shift, then they don't have as much time to be on platforms, tech platforms after hours, where they're building their profile and becoming more well-known, and it just compounds in many, many different ways. So unfortunately, the answer to your question, I think, is very simple, but it's hard. That it's a lot of things that contribute to that. And the good news, again, is that this is human behavior, so we can impact that if we take responsibility for it and look at it. And a lot of that is detailed, again, in this book. So it's like, how much time do you have on this podcast? We could go into that, but I would recommend folks who are interested in that question pick up this book.